Well, it's time to share, people. Time to share. And to share his thoughts here, it's an absolute pleasure to have our next guest, one of the world's leading technology and healthcare futurists out there, but also the founder and chair of OneShared.world. He's also the author of the bestseller Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. Here in Dubai, here at the GX Talks, here at the Government Summit, to talk on the subject of governance in an age of revolutionary technology. He will be in conversation with Professor Nancy Gleason of the New York University, NYU, Abu Dhabi. And so please welcome to the stage Jamie Metzl and Professor Nancy Gleason.
Fabulous. This is so exciting to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining us for this fireside chat without a fire. So, Jamie, you have done a lot of things, but I'm particularly thinking it's useful if we start off with talking about your latest book, Hacking Darwin, which is about human genetic engineering. Can you tell us why that's an important topic?
Sure. So thank you, Nancy, and thank you to all of you. We're, I think, on behalf of both of us, really thrilled and honored to be here. So,
yeah, good. These heels.
Do you want to sit?
I do,
okay.
if that's okay.
All right, we will sit. Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
There we go. So we humans, as everybody knows, life has existed on our planet for about 3.8 billion years. And in those 3.8 billion years, we have evolved through the twin Darwinian drivers of random mutation and natural selection. That each generation, each of an organism is slightly different from earlier versions, and then through competition, that's how we have evolved. That's 3.8 billion years. Now, for the first time in all of history, there's one species that has the increasing ability to read, write, and hack the code of life, of all of life, including of human life. We are at the early stages of this process. There are many millions of genetically engineered animals, not to mention the animals that have been genetically engineered by trial and error, like all of the domesticated animals that we have. But using the tools of molecular science, we have millions of genetically engineered animals, and now we have 3 genetically modified humans, 3 of the Chinese CRISPR babies. This is the beginning, at least I believe, of a transformation in the way humans reproduce that will, over time, have fundamental implications for just the evolution of our species. And the drivers of that, one are in vitro fertilization, which it was a big deal when it started 44 years ago. Now it's fully normalized. Embryo screening, the technical term is pre-implantation genetic screening. Right now, it's used in high-risk assisted reproduction with high-risk parents or high-risk embryos. And that's going to be used more across the board as a process of screening embryos, and that raises a lot of ethical issues. And then the issue of the tools of genetic engineering, we will over time, we're certainly not ready for that, but over time, we will use the tools of genetic engineering to modify pre-implanted human embryos. And we're going to do it for the exact same reasons that now we use healthcare. If a child is born with a deadly genetic disorder, we treat that disorder. We don't say, oh, that's Darwinian evolution or that's God's will. What we say is we don't want to have children dying of terrible diseases. That will be the entry point. But this is the beginning of a journey that is really foundational and fundamental for the future of our species. And so Hacking Darwin was exploring that process. And what I always say is that technology and science are what get us to the conversation, but the conversation itself is ultimately about values and ethics. It's about the decisions that we make to realize our very human aspirations using these tools.
So There's a governance challenge here on, which may be different across different cultural contexts, but what do you see as some of the governance opportunities in terms of genetic and genome engineering?
So you're right to use both of those terms. There's a challenge and there's an opportunity. So let's start with the challenge. And the challenge in genetics is similar to the challenge across a lot of these fast-moving technologies. And that is that the technologies are moving in many circumstances at an exponential rate. So they're on this J curve, and we're seeing it with everything we've learned about today. Digital technologies and technologies that can be digitized, not to mention quantum technologies that are just going to accelerate all of these things. And so just to give a sense of how quickly things are moving, in 2012 was when the basic science paper was written by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. It was a basic science paper laying out the science for how the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing system could be used to edit a living cell. It was a very big deal, but a basic science paper. 6 years later, 2018, was when the first CRISPR babies were born in China. So a basic science paper to application in living humans in 6 years. This is moving so quickly. And there's a real danger for all of these technologies that they will be misused. Every technology has a potential upside and a potential downside. You could say, well, how about something like the plow? That seems simple, but if you don't have plows, you don't have standing armies, you don't have warfare, you don't have all these things. The stirrup, oh, that seems simple. Well, the stirrup was what allowed the Mongols to conquer huge parts of the world, and a lot of people died in that. So every technology has an upside and a downside, and the most essential thing is to recognize certainly the downsides from the very beginning. And then the question for all of us is, well, how do we minimize the downsides and increase the likelihood that more optimal scenarios will play out? And so we need to be honest about the downs, and then we need to start building the norms and practices and structures to give us a better chance for the good things being realized. And that brings you to the issue of governance. And I know that in any society, but certainly in a society like this one, it's tempting to think of governance as what governments do. And certainly governments do governance, but for these technologies that are so distributed and decentralized, if we only think of governance as what governments do, it's going to be actually impossible, because governance happens at every level. It's, in this case, with the genetic technologies, it's what scientists and researchers do. It's what happens in healthcare settings like hospitals. It's professional standards. It's a lot of other things go into governance, and it's culture. And that's one of the reasons why talking about these issues, yes, we all need to be literate in science and technology. Yes, we need to be engaging with our governments and asking tough questions and even making recommendations. But it's not just about governments. We really need to think about building superstructures that will help our most cherished values be realized in the real world.
Okay, so we need governance beyond governments. And maybe even hoping that the industries producing some of this technology have their own moral and ethical codes. Have you seen examples of this anywhere?
Yeah, well, so all of, and certainly it's great that you bring up the companies, but companies are big drivers, and there certainly are many ethical companies, and I think most people, most companies, most governments want to be ethical. The question is that we live in these hyper-competitive environments where there are a lot of different pressures. So certainly there are companies, and I advise some of them, that are thinking about, well, how can we be as ethical as possible? But that's why I say this has to exist within the superstructure of society, and so it can't just be about self-regulation by companies. I mean, there has to be that has to be set within the context of, well, what are the rules? What are the norms? what are the reward structures, and really need to think holistically about how this works. But it's a key point, because competition is so fierce, if it turns out that doing the ethical thing, which may be a slower thing, it may be a more careful thing, is a competitive disadvantage for companies, and we allow circumstances where doing the wrong thing is rewarded, it may be that there'll be a small number of companies that will do the right thing and take the hit. But if over time there's a competitive advantage for doing the wrong thing, we're going to incentivize that. So that's why, again, it's all about ethics, it's all about values, it's all about reward structures and infrastructures.
Okay, so let's take it from the other perspective then of big global governance and the World Health Organization. You served on an expert advisory committee on the genome and its opportunities for manipulation. What are some of the key takeaways from that sort of global scale of governance?
Yeah, so it was really such an important experience for me. Immediately after the announcement of the birth of these first CRISPR babies in China, Dr. Tedros, who is actually speaking right now at the World Government Summit, thank you, Summit Assembly, he said, recognized this is a big deal. He created an expert advisory committee on human genome editing. I was certainly very honored to be invited to be part of that. And we were given this task, I think a very important task, of recommending, well, what should be at least the ideal rules of the road for how one of the most powerful technologies in all of human history, genetic engineering and particularly genome editing, can best be applied, because we don't want to say, oh, this is a really powerful technology, we should never use it, because there are all really important applications like gene therapies, treatments, and eventually cures for some really terrible diseases, and so we need to use these technologies. At the same time, we don't want to have just a total free-for-all, because that could amount to something equivalent to Nuremberg-style human experimentation, which is frankly why I'm such a harsh critic of what happened in China. I think it was the most disgusting human experimentation. I mean, it's just awful. And so we worked for 2 years, or more than 2 years, and we came up with our recommendations. But then there was a bit of a problem, and the problem is that we don't have a system for global governance. And we have a United Nations that isn't real, and I'm talking about this here in the summit tomorrow. We have a United Nations that's great. It's just not able to solve pretty much any of the biggest global problems our world faces. So we have a global governance crisis as our species is becoming fully globalized, as our species is becoming super empowered, as individuals among us are becoming super empowered. So it was just a relatively small number of people in China who made a decision. It wasn't entirely on their own, but to make a big step for humans. You could imagine a scenario, it's easy to imagine now after COVID-19, whatever the origins of this pandemic are, that a small number of people would say, wow, we've seen the devastation a pandemic can cause. We know what the attributes are of a virus that could wreak havoc. And we have some of the formulas that we can just download from the internet. What about making a synthetic biology pathogen that could be 1 million times deadlier than COVID? So we're entering this new era, and we really need to think about governance. And so my big takeaways from my experience with our WHO expert committee is governance is essential. Governance is beyond what governments do, although government regulation is absolutely essential. And that if we don't create a sufficient framework for solving all of global problems, we won't be able to solve any global problems. And whether that's the regulation of revolutionary technology, climate change, proliferation of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, or really anything.
Okay, well, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But, okay, so we're individuals at the end of the day in this room. What can we do to try and work to make sure this is a net positive outcome, that technology enhances us as individuals? You know, I anticipate that right now I'm wearing an Apple Watch. Eventually, I imagine a version of that is injected in me, and it enhances me as a human. So what can I do as an individual to make this happen at scale in some kind of ethical way?
Yeah, it's such an important question. It's really the essential question, because we would like, and probably in a place like where we are now, UAE or Singapore or some kind of place like that, like we would like to think, well, I don't really have a responsibility here because I trust my leaders, they're super smart people. I'm just going to sit back and these other guys are going to do it. But even in very well-governed societies, that is not a safe thing to do, because what we are talking about here is really, it's not just the future of humanity, it's the future of each person. It's your individual future. It's the future of your kids. And so we're all going to have to make very significant decisions personally and collectively. And so the first thing is becoming literate, for all of the people who are here, all of the people who are watching the video, by nature of just being here or watching this, you're already taking the first step. You're recognizing that there is a lot to learn, that we all, no matter who we are, need to be actively learning. The second is everybody is part of a community. And you need to be an ambassador, not just for education, but for raising the ethical issues. Because one of the things that we're talking about is, well, how do we set norms of what is and isn't okay? And though that diffuses through our communities, through our faith groups, through our civil society groups, ultimately through our government. So that's one. Number two is there will be, and coming to your point, a lot of individual decisions that people are going to make. How do I personally interact with these technologies? And it's going to be really scary, and this is going to happen to all of us. But if you haven't laid the foundation of your own thinking to get to that point, and you're just suddenly in a situation where something big and momentous is happening, and you have to make a decision on the spot, that's really hard. And so we need to educate ourselves, we need to engage with our leaders, and we need to recognize that we all have an essential role to play in building the kind of future that we'd like to inhabit.
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Nancy.
everyone.